They threw her away for being too much. Not too cruel, not too weak, not too slow. None of the things you'd expect to get a person discarded out here on the edge of the charted dark. No. They looked at her, at the size of her, at the way the floor seemed to lean toward her when she walked, and they decided the galaxy had simply made a mistake when it made her. So they folded her up like a letter nobody wanted to read, and they sent her as far away as a person could go. And for a long time, she agreed with them. I want you to picture her before any of this happened, before the soldiers, before the human, before the night the whole station learned her name and never forgot it. Picture a woman nearly 3 meters tall, broad across the shoulders like a doorway, with skin the color of wet slate and a low voice that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Picture her trying, every single day, to make herself smaller. That was the saddest part, not the size of her, the shrinking. Her name was Orun. Grieve Hollow wasn't a place people chose. It was a place people ended up. It hung at the ragged edge of the Tannel Reach, a battered ring of a station built around the burnt-out core of a moon that had died long before anyone bothered to name it. From the outside it looked like something half-eaten gray metal, patched and patched again, scorch marks nobody had cleaned, docking arms that creaked in a vacuum that should have been silent. Ships came through because they had to, not because they wanted to. Haulers refueling, salvagers offloading scrap. The kind of travelers who didn't want their faces logged anywhere official. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of ozone and old grease and the sweetish rot of recycled water. The lights buzzed. Somewhere in the walls, the pumps were always running, a heartbeat you stopped noticing after a week and couldn't sleep without after a month. There were maybe 400 souls living on the hollow at any given time, a stew of a dozen species, all of them tired, most of them broke, and none of them asking too many questions. It was, honestly, the perfect place to disappear. Which is exactly why Orun went there. She arrived on a labor contract, the kind they hand to people who have nothing else to sell but the work their bodies can do. She signed it without reading it. What did it matter? On her homeworld she had been a failure. Out here she could at least be a failure who was useful. The Savathi are not a small people. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Even the dainty ones, the prized ones, the ones who got chosen, they'd still tower over most of you. But among her own kind, smallness was the thing. A slender Savathi female, light on her feet, narrow through the shoulders, with a delicate frame and quick hands, that was the ideal. That was who the bonding circles wanted. The songs were about them. The carvings in the hall temples were of them. Smallness meant grace. Grace meant worth. And Orun had come out of her mother, the largest child anyone in her bloodline had seen in 3 generations. She kept growing past the age she was supposed to stop. She broke a ceremonial bench when she was 12, simply by sitting on it, and the whole hall went quiet, and her mother's face did something Orun never forgot. Not anger, worse than anger, a kind of grief, like something had been confirmed. By the time she came of age, she stood taller than most of the males. She could lift things 2 of them together couldn't. Her hands, when she pressed them flat against the temple stone during the rites, left prints in the dust that made the elders murmur. At her first bonding season, no one stepped forward for her. At her second, a male approached, and then his family pulled him back, whispering, and she heard one of them say the word. Ungainly. They said it like a diagnosis, like a thing you'd put down a sick animal for. At her third season, she didn't even go. She stood at the edge of the gathering field instead, in the long blue dusk of her world, and she watched the smaller females move through the dances, light as falling seeds, and she understood with a flat and final certainty that there was no place in any of it for her. She was a thing that had grown wrong. Too much bone, too much muscle, too much her. So she left. She took the first off-world labor contract she could find, and she didn't look back, because there was nothing behind her worth turning around for. That's how she came to Grieve Hollow. That's how she came to spend her days hunched over in corridors built for smaller folk, ducking under doorways, turning sideways to pass, folding her great frame down small in the corner of the mess hall so she wouldn't be in anyone's way. She wore her shame like a second skin. She had carried it so long she'd stopped being able to feel where it ended and she began. She did her work. She kept her head down. She spoke to almost no one. And she told herself that was the rest of her life, and that she could live with it. She was wrong about that. She was about to be very, very wrong. The day it started turning, it started like any other. There was a freighter in the long dock, an old bulk hauler called the Marigold's Patience, which is a beautiful name for an ugly ship. Half its load arms had seized. There was cargo in the hold that had shifted in transit, big sealed containers of mining ore that had broken loose of their cradles and slid into a wall, and now nothing would move them, and the dock cranes couldn't get the angle, and the ship was bleeding money for every hour it sat there. The dock chief came looking for the only worker on the hollow who might be able to fix that the slow, brute way. His name was Theo Mercer. He was human, and before you ask, no, there weren't many humans out that far. Earth's reach was a long way from the Tannel, and the ones who drifted out to the edge tended to be the kind running from something or towards something. You couldn't always tell which. Theo never said which. He'd been on the hollow about 2 years by then, ran the cargo and dock side of things for Madame Resk, who owned the station and most of the people on it in one way or another. He wasn't a big man. That's the thing I need you to hold on to. He came up to about Orun's ribcage, maybe. He had a bad leg from some old injury he never explained, and he walked with a hitch in his step, and he was going gray at the temples, though he couldn't have been past 40. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been left out in weather. He talked slow and quiet, and he had a way of looking at a problem with his head tilted, like he was listening to it, like the problem might just tell him how it wanted to be solved if he waited long enough. He found Arun in the maintenance bay, where she was eating alone, folded into her corner the way she always was. "You're the Savathi," he said. She didn't look up. People said things at her, not to her, and she'd learned not to give them the satisfaction. "Got a problem on the Marigold," he went on like she'd answered. "Couple tons of ore come loose in the hold. Cranes can't get to it. I need somebody who can shift it by hand and not get crushed doing it." A pause. "Pays double the standard rate. It's dangerous." She looked up then, not at the pay, at the way he'd said dangerous, like it was a fact about the job and not a question about her. "You want me," she said slowly, "because I'm big." And he just looked at her, head tilted, and said, "Yeah, that's the whole reason I walked over here." Like it was obvious, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Something happened in her chest that she didn't have a word for. For her entire life her size had been the problem, the flaw, the thing that disqualified her, and here was this small, gray, weathered creature treating it like a tool, like a skill, like something a person might want. She went and shifted the ore. It took her 4 hours. The hold was hot and tight, and the containers were the kind of heavy that talks to you, that groans when it moves, that would fold a body in half without noticing. She braced and lifted and walked them, one at a time, back into their cradles, and the human stood at the hatch the whole time, calling out angles, warning her when a container shifted, never once telling her to be careful in that nervous way people did when they were really telling her she was too much. He just worked the problem with her, 2 people, 1 problem. When she set the last container down and the cradle locks clamped home, she straightened up, and she heard her own spine crack from holding the bent-over posture she always held, and for a second she stood at her full height in that cramped hold, the top of her head nearly brushing the ceiling, and she felt, God, I don't know, tall. She felt tall, and for once it didn't feel like a sin. Theo handed her a water bulb. "You eat after that," he said. "Come on, Resk owes me a meal voucher and I can't finish a portion anyway." That was the first meal they ever shared. I don't want to make it sound like it all turned at once. It didn't. That's not how people work. She didn't stop shrinking the next morning. She didn't suddenly hold her head up. The shame she'd carried since she was 12 years old wasn't going to lift just because one stranger had been decent for an afternoon. But something had been pried open, a crack of light under a door she'd thought was sealed forever. She started getting more of the heavy work. Word got around the dock. There was a Savathi who could move what the cranes couldn't, who could free a jammed cargo door with her bare hands, who could brace a collapsing scaffold while the welders got clear. Theo made sure she got those jobs, and he made sure she got paid for them, fair, in full, which on the hollow was its own kind of miracle. And he talked to her. That was the strange part. He'd come find her at the end of a shift and just talk, ask her things, real things. He asked about her world, the long blue dusks, the gathering fields, the temple stones with the handprints in the dust. He didn't flinch when she told him about the bonding seasons, about standing at the edge of the field, about the word they'd used. He just listened, head tilted, and when she finished he was quiet for a while, and then he said something she carried with her for the rest of her life. He said, "Sounds like the problem was the size of their imagination, not the size of you." She didn't answer. She couldn't. But she turned that sentence over 1,000 times in the dark of her bunk. She asked him things back after a while. Cautiously, the way you'd reach toward a fire to see if it would burn you. She asked about Earth, about humans, about why he was so far out. He told her about the bad leg, a cargo accident years ago, a load that came down wrong and a man who didn't get clear in time. That man had been his brother. Theo had been the one who couldn't lift the load off him in time. That was why, she understood slowly, he'd looked at her that first day with something like relief. Because here, finally, was someone who could have lifted it, who could lift the things that crushed people. "You'd have liked him," Theo said. "My brother, he'd have laughed at you and me both. The big quiet alien and the broke gimp running a dead man's station at the end of the universe." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach. Pair of misfits. "Misfit?" she repeated. The word fit her like nothing ever had. "Yeah," he looked at her, and there was nothing in his face but plain warmth. "But that's just the galaxy not having a slot for us yet. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. Means the galaxy's got bad shelving." She laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it, this huge low rumble that startled them both, that turned heads across the mess hall. She hadn't laughed in, she couldn't remember. Years, maybe. The sound of it scared her a little. But Theo was grinning at her like she'd done something wonderful, and so she let it come. "There was a child on the hollow. I should tell you about the child, because the child matters to what happened later. His name was Pell. He was a Lurin, a small, big-eyed, quick-fingered species, and he was an orphan, which on a place like Grieve Hollow meant he was nobody's and everybody's and mostly his own. His parents had come through on a salvage crew and died in a hull breach when he was barely old enough to walk, and the station had simply absorbed him the way it absorbed everything else. He scavenged. He ran errands. He slept in a nest of blankets in a warm corner near the air recyclers, and he stole food when he had to, and people mostly let him. Because what were you going to do, space a kid? Pell was afraid of Orun at first. Everyone was, a little at first. She was the biggest thing on the station that wasn't bolted down. But Pell was a curious creature, and one day he watched her free a jammed loading ramp with her shoulder, watched her lift a thing the size of a transport pod, and set it down gentle as you'd set down a sleeping infant. And something in his small scavenger's brain decided she was the safest place on the whole hollow. He started following her. She pretended not to notice him at first. Then she started leaving food where he'd find it. Then, one cold cycle when the heat failed in the lower ring and people were huddling for warmth, she found him shivering in his blanket nest, and she did the only thing that made sense to her. She scooped him up, blankets and all, and tucked him against the warmth of her, this child who weighed nothing in her arms, and she held him until the heat came back. He fell asleep against her chest, and she sat very still so as not to wake him, and she thought about the bench she'd broken when she was 12, and the look on her mother's face, and she thought, I could break this child without trying, with one careless movement. And she understood, holding him, that she never would. That her size, the thing they'd thrown her away for, could be the gentlest thing in the world if she chose it to be. That was a new thought. It rearranged something in her. Pell took to calling her Big, just that, Big. It started as what he was afraid of, and it turned into the name he loved her by. He'd come running through the corridors hollering Big, Big, and the whole dock would smile because it was the one purely happy sound the hollow had. So now you have them, the three misfits, the discarded giant, the broken human, and the orphan child, a family the galaxy had no shelf for. They were happy in their small way for a while. It didn't last. Things like that never do, out on the edge. The dark is always hungry, and sooner or later it sends something to take what little you've managed to build. The Vosk came on a gray cycle. You'd hear the Vosk before you saw them. Their ships had a particular engine note, a deep grinding pulse, and the moment that sound came through the hollow's hull, the whole station changed. People stopped talking. Vendors covered their stalls. Doors closed. It was the sound of authority arriving, and out on the edge, authority never came to help. The Vosk ascendancy held the Tannel reach the way a fist holds a coin. They were a tall, plated species, chitinous, dark, with too many joints and a way of moving that was somehow both stately and like an insect, and they considered themselves the rightful order of that whole region of space. They didn't govern exactly. They collected tribute, tariffs, cargo, people sometimes when they decided a debt was owed. They came through the frontier stations on a circuit, and you paid what they said you owed, and you were grateful they didn't take more, and you did not make trouble. The patrol that docked at Grieve Hollow that cycle was led by a Vosk officer named Submarshal Drevik. I wish I could make you feel the size of the dread he brought with him. He came down the docking arm with 8 troopers behind him, all of them in the dark segmented armor of the Ascendancy, all of them armed, and he moved through the station like he already owned everyone in it, because in every way that mattered, he did. He had a scribe drone hovering at his shoulder, tallying everything its sensors touched. He stopped at stalls and read out figures, and the figures were always higher than they should have been, and no one argued, because the last person on the circuit who'd argued was not around anymore to talk about it. Theo met them at the dock, because that was his job, and Madame Resk stood beside him, because it was hers. Resk was a T'Chakan, a small, leathery, sharp-eyed creature who'd survived 40 years on the edge by knowing exactly when to bend, and she bent now low and offered the submarshal the formal greeting and the station's manifests. Drevik didn't look at her. He was looking past her. He was looking at Arun. She was at the far end of the dock, doing what she always did when something frightening happened, making herself smaller, folding down behind a stack of cargo, trying to be a thing the eye slid off of. But there is no hiding 3 meters of Savathi, and the submarshal's flat dark eyes found her and stayed. "What," he said, in the buzzing, layered voice of his kind, "is that?" "Labor submarshal," Resk said quickly. "Contract worker, heavy haul, she's nothing." "A Savathi," Drevik's head tilted, the chitin plates of his neck clicking, "off-world on a labor contract." He made a sound that might have been amusement. "I have never seen one so large. They breed them small on their world. This is a defect." He started walking toward her. "Defects are wasted on cargo work. The Ascendancy has uses for raw strength." And there it was, the thing Arun had spent her whole life being told. Defect, said again in a new mouth by a new authority, as if she carried a sign only the cruel could read. Theo stepped between them. He shouldn't have. Every instinct of survival on that station screamed against it. You did not put your body between a Vosk submarshal and a thing he had decided he wanted. But Theo did it, quiet and slow, with that hitch in his step, and he stood there at half the height of either of them, and he said, "She's under contract to this station. Contracts logged with the Reach Registry. You take her, that's theft of registered labor, and that goes on the manifest, and the manifest goes to the circuit audit." He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. You want to start a paper fight with your own bosses over one hauler, sub-marshal, that's your business, but it'll cost you more than she's worth. For a moment, one long ringing moment, nobody breathed. Drevik looked down at the small gray human standing in his path, the scribe drone word. Somewhere in the station a pump kept its steady heartbeat going, oblivious. And then the sub-marshal did the thing that bullies do when the math doesn't favor them yet. He smiled, if you can call it that, the way the plates of his face shifted, and he stepped back and he said, "The contract. Yes, we are nothing if not lawful." He turned to Resk. "I will review the station's full accounts, all of them, tonight. I'm certain we'll find the books are in perfect order." It was a threat. Everyone understood it was a threat. He was going to find something. They always found something. And when he did, the price would be paid in whatever currency he chose. He swept off toward the station office with his troopers, and the doc slowly, carefully, began to breathe again. Orun unfolded herself from behind the cargo. She was shaking. She came to Theo and she looked down at him, this man who just put himself between her and the most dangerous thing in the sector, and she didn't have words. "You shouldn't have," she finally managed. "He could have." "Yeah," Theo said. He was pale. His hands, she noticed, were trembling too. He'd been just as scared as she was. He'd just done it anyway. That was a thing she was learning about humans. The fear didn't stop them, it just rode along. He could have, he didn't. He looked up at her and his weathered face was very serious. "You're not a defect, Oro. I need you to stop letting people tell you that. Starting with him, starting with you." She didn't answer, but she stood up a little straighter and she didn't fold back down, and Theo saw it, and that was enough for both of them for now. That night the sub-marshal found his pretext. It was Pell. Of course it was Pell. The Vosk are nothing if not efficient at finding the exact thing that will hurt you most. Their accounting drone swept the station and flagged the orphan as an unregistered resident consuming station resources without recorded contribution, which is a long, cold way of saying a child no one had filed paperwork for. And under ascendancy law, an unregistered resource on a Vosk-administered station wasn't a person. It was salvage. Drevik summoned Resk and Theo to the office and laid it out in his buzzing, lawful voice. The station's books had irregularities, small ones, the kind every frontier station had, the kind he'd manufacture if he had to. The penalty was a fine the Hollow couldn't begin to pay, but the ascendancy was merciful. The debt could be settled another way. The unregistered Lurin juvenile would be taken into ascendancy custody as a labor asset, his future earnings garnished against the station's debt, and the matter would be closed. A child for a fine, for a thing they'd invented. Theo argued. Of course he argued. He argued the law, the registry, the audits, every paper lever he'd used at the dock, and this time the levers didn't work, because this time Drevik had built the trap carefully and there was no clause in it, no contract, no registry to hide behind. Pell wasn't registered. That was the whole point. The thing that had kept the child free, that nobody owned him, was now the thing that made him takeable. Resk wouldn't fight it. I want to be fair to her. She wasn't a cruel creature. She was a survivor. She'd watched the ascendancy break stations that resisted, watched whole crews vanish into Vosk custody over less than this. She'd done the math 40 years ago, and the math always came out the same. You give them what they want or they take everything. "It's one child," she said to Theo, and her voice cracked on it because she hated herself even as she said it. "It's one child or it's all of us. That's the choice. That's always the choice." Theo came out of that office with his jaw set in a way Orun had never seen. He found her in the maintenance bay, where Pell was curled up half asleep against her side, the child's small hand fisted in the heavy fabric of her work tunic. Theo crouched down, wincing with that bad leg, so he was level with the boy, and he looked at Orun over the child's sleeping head, and he told her, low and flat, what the sub-marshal meant to do. She felt it move through her like cold water, like the floor of the station had dropped away. They would take him at first shift. 2 troopers, a transfer cart, a labor manifest with the child's name typed into it like a line item. By the end of the cycle, Pell would be gone, fed into the Ascendancy's machine, one more small body laboring in some dark facility until he was used up. He would never run through these corridors hollering big, big, again. He would never get to grow up. He would just be spent, the way they'd nearly spent her. The way the galaxy spent everyone it had no shelf for. "No," she said. Theo looked at her. "No," she said again, and she heard her own voice fill the bay, that low, resonant sound she'd spent her life trying to swallow. "They are not taking him." "Aru," Theo's voice was gentle and terrible, "if we fight them, they'll. I know what they'll do." She looked down at the child sleeping against her, this weightless, trusting thing, and then she looked at the human who had taught her in the space of a few short weeks that the size of her was not a sin but a gift she'd never been allowed to open. "I have spent my whole life folding myself small so I would not be in anyone's way." Her hands closed slowly into fists, and the muscle moved in her great forearms like cables drawing tight. "I am done folding." And outside, faint and grinding through the hull, the Vosk engines turned over, the patrol readying for first shift, for the collection, for the small lawful theft of a child's entire life. The cycle clock ticked toward the hour. Theo stood up. He looked at her, the giant they'd thrown away, standing now at her full and final height, no longer hiding, no longer folding, filling the whole bay with the simple fact of herself. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, then we don't fold." He started for the door, that hitch in his step, going to do the brave and stupid thing one more time. But this time, for the first time in her life, Orun was going with him. First shift came gray, the way it always did on Grieve Hollow. The lights cycled up from their dim sleep setting to their dim awake setting, which was barely a difference at all, just enough to tell your body it was supposed to be tired in a new way. The pumps kept their heartbeat going in the walls. Somewhere a vendor was opening a stall, and the smell of recycled protein cooking drifted down the corridors, and for a few minutes the station almost felt like an ordinary place where ordinary people were waking up to an ordinary day. Then the Vosk engines changed pitch. You learned to read those engines if you lived out there long enough. The grinding pulse dropped lower, steadied, locked, the sound of a patrol craft running its boarding systems hot, the sound of soldiers getting ready to come collect. In the maintenance bay, Orun heard it through the deck plating under her feet, and she felt the old instinct rise in her like a tide. Fold down. Make yourself small. Get behind the cargo. Be a thing the eye slides off of. She did not move to obey it. She stood at her full height in the center of the bay, and for the first time in her life she let her body be exactly the size it was. 3 meters of slate-gray Savathi, broad through the shoulders, her hands hanging loose and ready at her sides. Pell sat on a crate behind her, awake now, big eyes flicking between the two adults, smart enough to know something was wrong even if he didn't know what. Theo stood beside her. He looked impossibly small next to her. He always did, but there was something in the set of his jaw that made him seem taller than he was. He'd been up all night. She could see it in the gray of his face, the red rim of his eyes. He'd spent the dark hours working the only weapon he really had, which was not his fists and not his bad leg but the cold machinery of Vosk law, looking for the one loose bolt in the trap Drevik had built. He thought he'd found it. He wasn't sure it would hold. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, not looking at her, looking at the door, "you let me talk first. You understand, I talk first. You don't move unless they move on the boy. And if they move on the boy." He was silent a moment. "Then you do what you have to do, and you do it so they can't undo it." He glanced up at her finally. "But Oru don't kill, not unless there's no other shape to it. You kill a Vosk officer on a registered station, the Ascendancy doesn't care who was right. They glass the whole place and call it order. Everybody here dies for it. You understand me?" She understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. The cruelty of the thing was that even now, even cornered, they had to be careful. They had to win without winning too hard. That was what it was to be small in a galaxy run by the big. She thought of all the years she'd been the big one, and how it had never once made her safe. "I understand," she said. The bay door hissed open. They came in 2 columns. 6 troopers this time, not 8-6, which told Theo something, though he filed it away rather than understanding it yet. 6 troopers in the dark segmented armor, weapons not raised but not slung either, held that ready middle way that means we'd rather not, but we will. And behind them, unhurried, with his scribe drone whirring at his shoulder cataloging every body in the room, came Sub-Marshal Drevek. He had a transfer cart, a small one, child-sized. He'd brought a cart for the child, and Arun looked at that cart, that small, clean, efficient cart, and something in her went very quiet and very cold. "By the order of the Vosk Ascendancy," Drevek began, in his layered, buzzing voice, reading from a manifest the drone projected in the air before him, "the unregistered Lurin juvenile resident of this station, designation pending, is hereby claimed as labor salvage in lieu of outstanding station debt. The asset will be remanded to Ascendancy custody. Resistance will be recorded as insurrection." He lowered the manifest. His flat, dark eyes found Theo. "You will produce the juvenile." "His name's Pell," Theo said. "The designation is irrelevant." "His name," Theo said again, slow and even, "is Pell. And before you take one more step, Sub-Marshal, you're going to want to hear what I logged with the Reach Registry at 0400 this cycle." The drones were changed pitch. Drevek's head tilted, the plates of his neck clicking. "At 0400, Theo went on, and his voice was steady God knows how, "I filed a kinship claim. Savathi kinship law, adoption of an orphan dependent into a registered bloodline. The Ascendancy's own treaty of accession recognizes Savathi kinship filings as binding instruments of legal personhood." He let that sit. "Pell isn't unregistered anymore, Sub-Marshal. He was adopted 4 hours ago. He has a bloodline. He has a name on a registry your own treaty has to honor. He's not salvage, he's a son." For a moment, one long ringing moment, Arun forgot how to breathe. He hadn't told her. He'd done it in the night, the filing, and put her name on it, made her the bloodline, made the child hers in the eyes of a law that didn't care about love but did care about paperwork. Pell was hers. The galaxy said so now, in writing. The orphan who called her big was her son. She felt the tears come, and she did not let them fall, because the most dangerous thing in the sector was standing 6 meters away with a cart, and now was not the time. Drevek was very still. And then he did the thing that taught Arun everything she would ever need to know about power. He reached out one chitinous hand toward the projected manifest, and with a flick of his claw he dismissed it, Theo's filing, the kinship claim, the registry log, all of it, wiped from the air like it had never been. The scribe drone whirred and produced a new document, a different document. "The filing is rejected," Drevek said, "on grounds of clerical irregularity. The matter will be reviewed in 90 days. Until review, the juvenile's status remains unregistered. The claim stands." He looked at Theo, and there was something almost gentle in it, the gentleness of a creature explaining to a smaller creature why the smaller creature had never had a chance. "You believed the law would protect you. The law is a tool. I hold the tool. It protects what I decide it protects." He gestured to his troopers, "Take the asset." And Theo understood too late the thing he should have understood all along. There had never been a loose bolt in the trap. There had never been a clever filing that could save them. Drevek hadn't built a legal trap. He'd built the appearance of one, because the appearance kept everyone polite and quiet and obedient right up until the moment of collection. The law was never the wall. The law was the curtain. And the thing behind the curtain was, and had always been, just this: men with guns who would do exactly as they pleased. The 2 lead troopers stepped forward, toward the crate where Pell sat frozen. Theo moved to block them, that hitch in his bad leg, putting his small body between the soldiers and the child. A trooper raised its weapon and fired. It wasn't lethal. They didn't waste lethal rounds on labor disputes. It was a stun lance, a coil of blue-white energy that caught Theo full in the chest and folded him like wet paper. He went down hard. His head cracked against the deck plating. He didn't get up. He lay there twitching, his bad leg bent wrong under him, his eyes rolled white, and a thin line of blood ran from where his skull had met the floor. And something in Orun that had been folding small her entire life, finally, completely, irreversibly stood up. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count. Because here is what the Vosk understood about strength. They understood it as a number, as mass times velocity, as weapons and armor and the ledger of who could hurt whom. They had spent 10,000 years measuring the galaxy that exact way, and by their measurements they were the biggest thing in the Tannel Reach, and a single Savathi hauler defect, they'd called her, raw strength wasted on cargo, was a quantity they had already priced and dismissed. What they did not understand, what their kind has never understood, what gets them in the end every single time, is that there is a kind of strength that does not come from the body at all. It comes from a small broken human lying on the floor who put himself between a child and a gun knowing exactly what it would cost him. It comes from a creature who has been told her whole life that she is too much, finally meeting a moment that needs every ounce of the too much she is. It comes from love deciding it is done being careful. Orun crossed the bay in 2 strides. The trooper who had fired didn't even get its weapon up again. She took the stun lance out of its hands, not snatched, took, the way you take a toy from a child, and the trooper came with it for a moment because its grip didn't release in time, and she set the soldier down against the bulkhead hard enough to crack the armor, and not the bones inside it, because Theo had told her not to kill, and somewhere under the white roar in her skull she was holding to that. She was holding to it with everything she had. The second trooper fired. The lance caught her square in the chest. And here is the other thing the Vosk did not know because they had never bothered to learn it. Savathi are dense. Their bones are packed close, their flesh layered thick, evolved over millions of years on a heavy world where the very air had weight. A stun lance calibrated to fold a human in half hit Orun like a hard slap. It hurt. It rocked her. It did not stop her. Her kind was built to carry mountains. A little blue light was nothing. She walked through it. She walked through the second lance and the third, the energy crackling and dying against her, and she reached the troopers and she began, methodically, with terrible restraint, to take them apart. Not to kill, to disarm. She bent weapons in her fists until they were scrap. She pinned soldiers against bulkheads by their armor plating and held them there. One drew a blade and she caught the wrist, and the blade clattered to the deck, and the soldier went very still, dangling, its feet off the floor, understanding all at once that it was a small thing in the grip of something it had badly, fatally misjudged. It was over in perhaps 20 seconds. 6 of the Ascendancy's soldiers, the most feared armed force in the sector, were down, disarmed, broken weaponed, 2 unconscious and 4 pinned, and 1 held in the air by the back of its carapace, and not one of them was dead. Every single one would walk away from it. She had made sure. Even now, even in the white roar, she had made sure, because the small human on the floor had asked her to, and she would not let him down even while he couldn't see her do it. She set the last trooper down, and she turned to face Sub-Marshal Drevek. The bay had filled. I should tell you that because it matters to how it ended. Somewhere in those 20 seconds the corridors had emptied out and the people of Grieve Hollow had come not to fight. They had no weapons and no chance, but to witness, to stand in the open hatchways and the side passages, 100 faces, 200, the whole battered population of the station, drawn by the sound and held there by something they couldn't have named. Resk was among them near the front, her sharp old eyes wide. They watched. They didn't run. For the first time in the long, obedient history of that station, the people did not lower their eyes and close their doors. Drevek stood alone in the center of his ruined patrol, and for the first time the gentleness was gone from him, and what was underneath it was fear, badly hidden. "You have assaulted Ascendancy soldiers," he buzzed, and there was a tremor in the layered voice now. "On a registered station. This is insurrection. The penalty is the station, all of it, everyone in it." He drew himself up. "I will report this. A cruiser will come. There will be nothing left of this place but a stain on a chart. You have killed them all, Savathi. You have killed every one of them with your defect. There it was, the word, one last time, defect. And Arun looked down at this creature, the most powerful thing she had ever stood before, the embodiment of every authority that had ever measured her and found her wrong, and she felt the word land, and she felt it not stick. It just slid off, like she was something the cruelty couldn't catch hold of anymore. She did not pick him up. She did not break him. She'd learned in those 20 seconds the lesson the human had been trying to teach her for weeks, that the size of her was never the thing to be ashamed of, and it was never, either, the thing to be proud of. It was just a tool, and what you were measured by, what mattered, was the thing you chose to do with the strength you had. So she chose. "You won't report it," she said. Her voice filled the bay, low and certain, and the witnessing crowd went silent to hear it, "because your machine recorded everything." She nodded at the scribe drone hovering forgotten at his shoulder, its little sensor eye still patiently logging. Every word, the fabricated debt, the rejected filing, the order to fire on an unarmed man, the cart you brought for a child. She let it hang. "You said it yourself, Sub-Marshal. The law is a tool, and whoever holds it decides what it protects. Right now your own drone is holding it. And the moment that record reaches your superiors, it won't show an officer putting down a riot. It'll show an officer who lost a productive station, lost his patrol to a single hauler he was too proud to price correctly, and manufactured a debt to steal a child for sport." She tilted her head, the way she'd seen Theo do, listening to a problem. "How does the ascendancy reward officers who lose stations and embarrass the order in the permanent record? I think you know better than I do." Drevik's plates had gone an ugly mottled color. The drone whirred between them, holding both their fates in its little memory. "There's another shape this can take," Arun said, and from the floor faint a voice rasped, told you not to kill, Theo, conscious, barely, dragging himself up against a crate, blood down the side of his gray face, alive. She had to lock her knees to keep from going to him. Later, she told herself, win it first, then go to him. "There's another shape," she said again, steadier now. "Your drone records that Sub-Marshal Drevek, upon reviewing the matter personally, found the station's debt to be in error, that he voided the salvage claim on the registered juvenile dependent registered, because you're going to approve that kinship filing right now, this minute, on the record with your own authority, that he resolved a clerical confusion with ascendancy efficiency and proceeded on his circuit. No insurrection. No assault, your troopers had a training accident in microgravity, regrettable, no fault assigned." She crouched slowly, bringing her great face level with his. "You walk out of here alive, with your rank, with your patrol, with a clean record that makes you look competent. Or you walk out of here with a recording that ends your career and possibly your life, assuming you walk out at all." A pause. "That's the whole choice, Sub-Marshal. That's always the choice, isn't it?" She gave him back his own words, the exact words Resk had used in the office. "That's the choice. That's always the choice." The words of every small, frightened person who'd ever bent because bending was survival. Only now it was the big one who had to bend. He bent. Of course he bent. The math had flipped, and Drevek was, above all things, a creature who obeyed the math. He approved the filing, Pell's kinship registered, witnessed, logged, irreversible. He voided the debt. He spoke the words for the record in a voice like grinding stone, every syllable costing him something, while 200 witnesses watched the most feared thing in the Tannel Reach do exactly as a discarded Sevati hauler told him to. Then he gathered his troopers, the conscious ones carrying the unconscious ones, the empty child cart left forgotten in the corner of the bay, and he went back up the docking arm without another word. The Vosk engine spun up. The grinding pulse climbed, steadied, and then faded as the patrol craft disengaged and burned away from Grieve Hollow, off to find some other station with people too small and too frightened to do anything but pay. They never came back. I'll tell you that now so you're not waiting for it. In all the years after, the Ascendancy's circuit somehow always rooted around the Hollow. A clerical thing, surely. A scheduling quirk. Funny how those work out. In the maintenance bay, the silence came down like snow. And then Arun was on her knees beside Theo, all the held-back fear breaking out of her at once, her huge hands hovering over him, terrified to touch, terrified of her own strength even now. Don't move your head, you hit your. Fine, he slurred. He very much was not fine, but he was grinning at her, this lopsided bloody grin, and he lifted one shaking hand and rested it against the side of her face, which was as far up as he could reach. Knew you'd figure the angle, listen to the problem. It'll tell you how it wants to be solved. His eyes were having trouble focusing. Told you, not a defect. Theo. Pair of misfits, he mumbled, and then his eyes rolled and he went under, but he was breathing, and she could feel his heart going under her palm when she laid it on his chest, fast but steady. The small, stubborn human heart that had decided to stand between a child and a gun. And then there was a weight against her side, small, light, trembling, and she looked down and Pell had crossed the bay and pressed himself into her. His small fists knotted in her tunic, and he was crying the way children cry when the fear finally has somewhere to go. Big, he sobbed. Big, you're so big. And for the first time in her entire life, when someone said that to her, it didn't sound like a wound. It sounded like thank you. I'll tell you how it ended, the larger way, because you've earned it for listening this long. Theo lived. Took him a long while to mend. That skull crack was no small thing, and his bad leg got worse before it got better. And there were weeks where Arun did the dock work and the heavy work and the carrying Theo to the medbay work all at once and never once complained, because she had finally found the thing her strength was for. Not hauling or holding up the people she loved. Madame Resk came to her after. The old Teachakin, who had done the survivor's math her whole life, who had been ready to hand a child to the dark because the math always came out the same. She came to Arun in the bay and she stood there a long time, working up to it, and finally she said in her dry, cracked voice, I was wrong. 40 years I was wrong. I thought the only choice was bend or break. She looked at the place on the floor where Drevik had buzzed out his surrender. I never knew there was a third thing. You could stand. And not break and make them bend instead. She shook her leathery head slow. Old fool, took a girl they threw away to teach me that. Word got out the way word does on the edge. The story of the hollow, the station that didn't fold, the human who wouldn't move, the Savathi giant who took apart a Vosk patrol and didn't kill a soul. It traveled the salvage routes and the hauler lanes and the quiet places where discarded people end up. And the discarded people started to come. Not many at first, then more. The too big and the too broken and the too strange. The ones the galaxy had no shelf for, drifting into the one place that had proven it didn't measure a person the way everyone else did. Grieve Hollow stopped being a place people ended up. It started being a place people chose. And Arun, the largest Savathi in 3 generations, the one no one stepped forward for, the one who stood at the edge of the gathering field in the long blue dusk, and understood there was no place for her in any of it. Arun stood in the open dock of that station years later, at her full and final height, never folding, never shrinking, with a man who came up to her ribcage holding her hand and a half-grown Lurin boy who still called her big running circles around them both. She had a bloodline now. She had a name people said with love. She had a place that the size of her had built and held and filled. The galaxy had spent her whole life measuring her wrong. It took one small broken man from one small blue world to do the only math that ever mattered, to look at every part of her that everyone else had called too much, and to find in the end the simplest answer there is. She was not too big. She was just exactly large enough to hold everything that ever mattered. And nobody, not her mother, not the bonding circles, not the sub-marshal with his cart and his cruelty and his defect, nobody ever made her feel small again.